let's talk about A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr. This was the only novel published by him during his lifetime. In fact, after he published it, he didn't publish anything else in fiction for the rest of his life, which was over 30 years. There was a sequel published after his death, which was polished by an author he had chosen. This is a 1950s book, but fixed up in 1961 because it's three 100-page novellas about the order of the Blessed Leibowitz, who, after the flame deluge and atomic war, basically started a monastic order, a Christian monastic order, to preserve knowledge, to try to help humanity through the next dark age. And the three stories are set at different points in time. They are connected by the order and by themes, but they are different stories with different characters, different things going on in them. So you see like a big stretch of human history in this new dark age and so on. It's interesting. They are three quite different stories. They cover similar themes, touch on similar themes, but they have very different feels. Particularly the first one feels quite different from the second and third ones, and indeed the second one. The first one is significantly involves, looking a lot at one character and a kind of confusing, baffling, comic discovery. The second one is a heavily political and philosophical one, and the third one deals with philosophy too, but it kind of expands into different areas. Again, it does different things again. They all deal with philosophy and theology and whatever else. Walter Miller, relevantly, was in a bombing crew that bombed the casino at Monte Cassino. The monastery at Monte Cassino during World War II, and he converted to Catholicism after the war, and this was pretty explicitly something that was partly to do with him working out his thoughts about that. A bit like David Drake with Hammer's Slammers, which he now recognises as his therapy that he never had in the 70s for his service in Vietnam. This is a old school sci-fi novel in many ways. It's written not in the sense it's kind of dry and there's no characters and it's all just about random science stuff. That's not what old school sci-fi is anyway. But rather that it doesn't show the stylistic leanings of the new wave. It's not sort of fashionable and jazzy in the way that stuff you read coming out in the 60s and 70s is intentionally trying to wrestle itself free of something it sees as stifling. This is, nor is it old school sci-fi per se. It's actually written pretty straight. It's written like a literary novel almost in many ways of the time. The writing style is generally quite pleasant. There's some good bits of description. It can be very funny, particularly in the first story. The characters are very well drawn, and that goes beyond writing skill into something else beyond stylistic skill. Miller is very good at drawing all kinds of different writers, chiefly the monks, brothers, abbots of the Abbey of St. Leibowitz, which is over in the Arizona desert or something like that. I don't know exactly where. It's in the southwestern region of the United States, and you see, I think literally once you go to one other significantly different place. But other than that, generally speaking, twice. But generally speaking, you're nearly always in and around the monastery. So you get a very well drawn environment, nicely pictured. This very arid environment. Which will hark back in Miller's mind less to the Benedictines, and the Leibowitzians are a pretty Benedictine order, but more actually to St. Anthony in the desert. Your Simeon Stylites sitting on top of a stone pillar, which I feel like Terry Pratchett had a riff on one time. So more like that, this sense of kind of things have gone wrong, there's a disaster, civilization is being protected in this out of the way, obscure, strange place. The character's really well drawn, the environment is well drawn, and he realises a different style with each story. I think the thing I'd say beyond that is how well he tries to bring up and talk about issues of the human heart, human behaviour, Why has nuclear war happened? He's writing at a time in the mid-50s when it's become a threat. The idea that the world might just be blown up forever is a threat. There's space travel. We're starting to go into space, but we're also on the one button push away, sort of thing, from annihilation. And so he says, what happens if that happens? It's a very different experience to James Morrow's This Is the Way the World Ends, which is, also from much later in the 80s. But This Is the Way the World Ends is, one, it shows the influence of the new wave. It's much more stylistically experimental. But also, in that case, the everything is intentionally quite, I don't know, we'd now call it meta, but is very intentionally abstract, almost surrealized. Whereas here, this is pretty straight. These are just people, the monks in a desert. They preserve knowledge they don't always fully understand. They want to. They try to unpick it and decipher the half-burnt, faded blueprints, the odd notes they find, the bits and pieces, the letters that have survived, the one or two books of actual physical science, which they don't actually have the background to get straight away. So there's this long process of trying to work out what's even going on, And he realizes that journey really well, especially over the span of the three stories, as you see the story, the plot, the world develop, and into that, as I say, he brings in issues of human behaviour, the human heart. What is it that means that we end up risking blowing ourselves up? What is it that leads us to try to preserve things and rebuild things? And some people would certainly find there are other applications for that message, not just over nuclear war, but over all kinds of things. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed that. I thought it was a serious moral reflection with very good aesthetic quality, artistic values. I think there were one or two things, like certainly there are a couple of points where there's not always, most of the philosophical dialogues or moments of reflection are well done. One or two I don't think are fully digested. They stick out slightly, and it even slightly affects the style. Things become more awkward because suddenly you're trying to express a point. This is a book in that sense with a message. It's not a one-note message. It's not simplistic. Even when there are obviously characters or ideas or behaviours that the author pretty explicitly is like, well, that's not good. He wants to give everyone their due. He wants to be like, well, why do people actually do this, and what are the arguments for this, and how can we understand and love other people, and seeing it through the eyes of these monks who are very flawed people, but who nonetheless are trying to live this life of the acquisition of wisdom and of love for others. It's just really interesting and effective. So yeah, with just that one caveat about it doesn't always work. The thoughts are sometimes slightly too big for the format he's putting them in. I think this is generally a very successful book. I think as a decent intro to old school sci-fi, in the sense one that someone could read and feel like was stylistically pretty normal for them, wasn't odd or stilted or hyper stylized in an old-fashioned way, or massively into genre tropes, but instead was sort of just an ordinary book that happened to be about an order of monks who preserve knowledge after a nuclear apocalypse. I would recommend it in that very specific perhaps context. It's a good starter in classic sci-fi for those who maybe are used to more ruminative and more literary books now. If you've read this, I'd love to hear what you think. I have not read the sequel. The reviews, I think, are kind of like, yeah, it's okay. Some people are like, oh, it's quite good actually. It's really quite good, but it's not as good as one of the all-time greats. I haven't read it. If you've read it, I'd love to hear what you think about it. Other post-apocalyptic fiction, our world where everything's gone horribly wrong. I'd love to hear about that, and indeed anything else along those lines. Put it in the comments. Till next time.